Imagine this. You're a young bride named Margot, just 15 years old, standing in the doorway of a stone cottage in 1347 AD. Your new husband, Henrik, is walking toward your marriage bed. The rushes under your bare feet crackle with every nervous step you take. The candlelight dances across his weathered face. He's almost twice your age, picked by your father because of his 3 pigs and half an acre of barley. Your hands tremble as you grip the coarse woolen shifter your mother made for this special night. The same one she wore and her mother before her. You can hear his friends outside through the thin walls, drunk on ale, yelling crude cheers and banging pots with wooden spoons. They won't go until they get some confirmation of what's happened. You find yourself breathing in quick, shallow breaths as Henrik's rough fingers move toward the leather cord around your neck. And you can't help but think if your mother's quiet warnings about wifely responsibilities ever really prepared you for what's about to unfold in this small, smoky room that reeks of damp wool and unwashed people. This isn't a love story. It's a glimpse into the reality of intimacy in medieval times. It's a world where sexual practices were influenced by superstition, fear of religion, and instincts for survival, which can feel completely alien compared to our modern views on romance and desire. Before we explore these overlooked tales of endurance and pain, if you're interested in uncovering the hidden aspects of history, think about giving that like button a click and subscribing for more content like this. I'd love for you to comment below and share where you're tuning in from. It's amazing to think that we're diving into these ancient tales together, even though we're from all over the world, united by our curiosity about history. The medieval bedroom was like a battlefield, a place where bodies turned into political territories. It was a site of conflict between the church's teachings and pagan customs, and even the most private moments of life were controlled by such strange and limiting rules that they'd probably shock someone living today. Crawl. These decisions went beyond personal preferences. They involved issues of eternal salvation, family honor, and literally life and death. Let me take you back to Margot's world, where the idea of marital rape was non-existent because wives were seen as property, where menstrual blood was viewed as so harmful it could ruin crops, and where choosing the wrong sexual position could condemn your soul to hell forever. In medieval Europe, the marriage bed was hardly ever a private space. The community, the church, and old superstitions all played a role in what went on between a husband and wife. When Margot tied the knot with Henrik in the fall of 1347 AD, their union wasn't marked by champagne and dancing. It was more of a business deal finalized with bodily fluids, and neighbors were present, expecting to see proof that the marriage had been consummated. The wedding night tradition actually started way before the couple had any physical contact. It kicked off with the bedding ceremony, where the guests would literally pull the bride and groom to their room, take off their clothes while singing playful songs, and then gather outside the door, eagerly listening for the sounds that would prove the marriage was official. Henrik's friends wouldn't leave until they heard Margot crying out in pain, which was the confirmation that her hymen had been broken and their marriage had been consummated. But this is where medieval intimacy takes a really strange turn. The church taught that even married couples could commit serious sins in their own bedrooms. St. Jerome, writing in the 4th century AD, stated that a man who loves his wife too passionately is considered an adulterer. The church fathers thought that indulging in too much pleasure, even in marriage, was harmful to the soul. This belief wasn't just abstract theology. It influenced all areas of sexual behavior in medieval times. Thomas Aquinas, the influential theologian of that era, established clear guidelines for married couples in his work, the Summa Theologica, around 1265 AD. He stated that sexual intercourse was only appropriate on specific days of the week, during certain seasons, and should always occur in one particular position, with the man on top and the woman underneath, facing each other. Any deviation from the norm was seen as unnatural and, consequently, sinful. Oral sex was completely banned, along with sex during menstruation, pregnancy, or breastfeeding. The church estimated that if all these guidelines were obeyed, married couples would only be able to have sex roughly 50 days a year. Margot likely picked up these rules from her mother, who had learned them from the village priest during confession. The threat of eternal damnation loomed over every intimate moment. When Henrik reached for her on a forbidden Wednesday during Lent, she found herself facing an impossible decision. Should she submit to her husband's wishes and risk her soul, or refuse him and face his anger in a world where domestic violence was not just tolerated, but expected? The medieval view of female sexuality was rooted in deep misunderstandings that would endure for centuries. Medical texts from ancient Greece and Rome conveyed the idea that women were basically flawed versions of men. They described female sexual organs as just inverted male genitalia. The vagina was viewed as an inside-out penis, while the ovaries were seen as internal testicles. This belief wasn't just a result of ignorance. It was a set of medical knowledge that was taught in universities all over Europe. These ideas significantly influenced how people in the medieval period viewed female desire and pleasure. In the 11th century AD, the physician Constantine the African noted that women experienced sexual pleasure in a way that was different from men. He argued that women needed longer stimulation and multiple orgasms in order to conceive. This gave rise to the strange idea that rape couldn't lead to pregnancy because it was thought a woman wouldn't experience pleasure during the assault. In medieval courts, this was often seen as evidence that she had actually enjoyed it, and was, therefore, partly to blame. Margot's mother might have cautioned her about the wandering womb, which medieval doctors believed could lead to hysteria, madness, or even death. People believed that the uterus could actually shift around inside a woman's body, moving up to suffocate her heart or down to escape through her vagina. They tried various treatments, like using pleasant scents to fumigate the vagina in hopes of coaxing the womb back into position, or applying unpleasant smells to the nose to encourage it to move downward. During the medieval period, a tangled mix of fertility beliefs from pagan traditions continued to exist, even though the church tried to eliminate them. Village-wise women, who were often labeled as witches in later times, kept secret knowledge about herbs, rituals, and practices aimed at promoting conception, avoiding pregnancy, or ensuring that male children were born. In the woods around Margot's village, women came together to pick certain plants during the full moon. They would brew pennyroyal and tansy into teas that were thought to prevent pregnancy. Even though the line between effective contraception and danger was dangerously narrow, the mandre root, which resembled a human figure, was believed to boost fertility when worn close to the skin as an amulet. The root was so precious that people often made fake versions from carved briar to sell in medieval markets. The church condemned these practices as witchcraft. But even the most devoted Christians found it hard to let go of them completely. The distinction between folk medicine and magic was nearly impossible to define. A woman might pray to St. Margaret for a safe childbirth, while also burying a piece of afterbirth under her doorstep to ensure she would be fertile in the future. She might wear a crucifix to church while secretly keeping a piece of amber tucked between her breasts to help avoid miscarriage. Contraception in medieval times was a risky mix of superstition, harmful substances, and sheer desperation. Women were advised to jump backwards 7 times after having sex to prevent getting pregnant, or to drink wine blended with crushed bees. The potions made from mercury, lead, and other harmful substances were even more dangerous, often resulting in the death of the woman and any potential pregnancy. The consequences of an unwanted pregnancy were dire. In a time without dependable contraception, women lived with the ongoing risk of dying during childbirth. The rates of maternal mortality were shocking. 1 in 3 women died during or shortly after giving birth. For unmarried women, being pregnant often led to social ruin, banishment, or even death. Although infanticide was officially condemned, many saw it as a desperate woman's only option. In medieval times, marriage negotiations were approached like military operations, with bodies being the main point of contention. When Margot's father set up her marriage to Henrik, her virginity was essentially her dowry, worth more than any gold or livestock he could provide. It became a form of honor, exchanged between families as a testament to their daughter's purity and the family's reputation. The wedding night was about more than just consummation. It involved a public check to see if the bride was a virgin. The stained sheets would be shown to everyone gathered as evidence that the marriage was real. If there were no blood, the bride could be sent back to her family in shame, marked as a fraud, or even face death for it. The pressure on young brides was tremendous. Some people would secretly poke their fingers or stash away chicken blood to create fake evidence that their new families wanted. However, the understanding of virginity in medieval medicine was seriously misguided. They thought that the hymen was a solid membrane, fully sealing the vaginal opening, instead of recognizing it as the flexible tissue that it really is. They believed that not having it was clear evidence of sexual activity, but in reality, it could be affected by horseback riding, heavy lifting, or just the natural differences in anatomy. The church's teachings about consummation led to some strange practices. A marriage wasn't seen as legally valid until the couple had sex, which meant that proving or disproving consummation turned into a legal issue. Church courts would look into both the husband and wife, talking to them separately about personal details of their wedding night. They would check the woman's body for any signs of penetration and ask neighbors what they might have overheard through the walls. While church doctrine set strict rules on medieval sexual positions, the actual situation was much more complicated. The missionary position wasn't just the favorite, it was seen as the only one that wouldn't send your soul to hell. The church taught that any position with the woman on top went against nature because it disrupted the natural order of male dominance. Rear entry was viewed as animalistic, connecting human sexuality to how animals mate. Medieval literature suggests a more intricate reality beneath the surface. The fabliaux, which are these humorous tales popular in medieval France, depict sexual escapades that would have shocked church leaders. Often recounted by wandering minstrels in taverns and market squares, these stories uncover a hidden world where couples dared to explore forbidden practices, even with the looming fear of eternal damnation. The French poet Andreas Capellanus, who wrote around 1184 AD, talked about complex courtship rituals, providing specific guidance on sexual positions and techniques. His writings indicate that, at least within noble circles, there was a refined awareness of sexual pleasure that surpassed the restrictive teachings of the church. But these practices were risky secrets. If discovered, they could lead to excommunication, exile, or even death. People in medieval times lived in fear of sexual demons, thought to target humans during their most vulnerable times. The succubus and incubus weren't just tales, they were widely accepted as medical and theological truths. Church leaders believed that these demons could disguise themselves as humans to tempt both men and women, draining their life energy through sexual encounters. The succubus, a female demon known for seducing men, was often held responsible for wet dreams, sexual fantasies, and any sexual desires that arose outside of marriage. During the medieval period, theologians created detailed theories explaining how these demons functioned. They thought that a demon could initially take on a female appearance to gather semen from a man, and then change into a male form to impregnate a woman with the stolen seed. It was believed that any child resulting from such a union would be cursed or demonic. The incubus was seen as an even bigger danger to women in medieval times. These male demons were said to be stronger than humans and able to overpower their victims easily. Women who talked about sexual dreams or experiences they couldn't make sense of were frequently accused of having dealings with demons. The distinction between being a victim and being labeled a witch was alarmingly blurred. What we now know as sleep paralysis, which is a neurological condition, was seen as an instance of demonic sexual assault. Both men and women who woke up unable to move, often feeling a heavy weight on their chest, were thought to be victims of a demonic attack. The church laid out complex rituals for exorcism and purification, but many people suspected of witchcraft were actually burned at the stake instead. During the medieval period, the understanding of menstruation was filled with fear and superstition that lasted for hundreds of years. Menstrual blood was thought to be so toxic that it could poison crops, spoil wine, and even make men lose their vitality. The Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder, whose writings were still examined in medieval universities, asserted that menstrual blood could drive dogs insane and make knives lose their sharpness. During their monthly cycles, women were seen as dangerous pollutants who needed to be kept away from regular society. They were not allowed to enter churches, prepare food, or handle sacred items. In a lot of villages, women who were menstruating had to stay in separate huts away from everyone else until their bleeding ended. The church believed that menstruation was a punishment from God for Eve's original sin, turning each monthly cycle into a reminder of shame for women. This misunderstanding of menstruation led to some strange medical practices. Doctors thought that if menstrual blood wasn't fully released from the body, it would build up and harm the woman internally. To fix this, they suggested methods like bloodletting, purging, and other risky treatments to balance a woman's humors. Some physicians even advised sexual intercourse as a remedy for menstrual issues, thinking that male semen could counteract the harmful effects of menstrual blood. Women in medieval times created their own hidden understanding of how to manage their menstrual cycles. They relied on materials like moss, cloth rags, and sheepskin for basic protection. They kept track of their cycles using the phases of the moon and developed herbal remedies to help with cramps and regulate their flow. This knowledge was handed down through generations of women, carefully kept away from male doctors and church officials who could label it as witchcraft. During the medieval era, people developed complex ideas about sexual compatibility that were based on astrological signs, bodily humors, and physical traits. Physicians of that time thought that achieving sexual pleasure and fertility relied on having the right mix of hot and cold, as well as wet and dry humors in both individuals. A husband who is very passionate might not get along well with a wife who is more reserved, which can create issues with their sex life and even lead to problems with having children. In wealthy families, it was quite normal to have a physical examination of potential partners. Doctors would check the bride's body to look for signs of her sexual nature. For instance, wide hips were seen as a sign of fertility, while narrow hips were thought to indicate that someone might struggle to conceive. The size and shape of the groom's penis were evaluated to see if it would be a good match for his future wife. These assessments were carried out with the same objective approach that one might use when looking at livestock. Meanwhile, the church officials came up with their own ideas about sexual compatibility, focusing more on spiritual traits than on physical ones. They believed that couples who were too closely related, whether by blood or spiritual ties, would face curses of sexual dysfunction and end up with deformed children. The intricate rules surrounding family relations meant that many marriages in the medieval period were annulled once previously unknown connections came to light. During this time, sexuality was heavily linked to ideas of honor, shame, and social status. A man's ability in bed was closely tied to how people viewed him as a warrior and a leader. Being impotent wasn't just a private issue, it could lead to public embarrassment that might ruin a man's reputation in his community. The medieval French came up with intricate euphemisms for sexual issues, crafting a language of shame that affected all areas of social life. For women, their sexual reputation was really delicate. Just a small suggestion of wrongdoing could ruin a woman's chances of getting married and damage her family's reputation. In medieval towns, which were tight-knit communities, everyone was aware of each other's affairs. If a woman was spotted conversing with a man who wasn't her husband or a family member, she could easily be labeled as inappropriate. The expectations for how women should behave were so strict that even those who were married constantly worried about gossip and being accused of misconduct. The legal system in medieval times showed these sexual fears in how it dealt with issues like rape, adultery, and sexual assault. Rape wasn't seen as a crime against the woman herself. Instead, it was viewed as a crime against the man who had ownership over her, whether that was her father, husband, or lord. The consequences for rape could change significantly based on the social standing of both the victim and the offender. A nobleman who assaulted a peasant woman might only have to pay a small fine, but a peasant who assaulted a noblewoman would likely face torture and even death. Adultery was met with even harsher penalties, but this was only for women. If a married woman had relations with any man other than her husband could kill her without facing any legal repercussions. The medieval law code explicitly allowed husbands to murder their unfaithful wives and their lovers if they caught them in the act. Men, on the other hand, usually had the freedom to have sexual relationships with unmarried women, prostitutes, or their own servants without facing any legal issues. During the medieval era, complex courtship rituals emerged that would shape European culture for many years to come. The concept of courtly love, made famous in the poetry of the troubadours, established an alternate reality where sexual longing was seen as a spiritual journey. These romantic notions were mostly a literary dream cherished by the nobility, but they significantly influenced how people in the medieval period viewed love and sexuality. The concept of courtly love suggested that genuine love could only thrive outside of marriage. A knight's loyalty to his lady was meant to be forever unfulfilled, creating a perpetual longing that was thought to cleanse the soul through pain. This led to a strange divide where marital sex was seen as just a practical matter, while romantic love was considered something entirely spiritual. In reality, courtship in medieval times was much more down to earth. For peasants, young people had some say in who they married, but financial factors usually came first, overshadowing personal desires. A girl from the village might have a crush on the blacksmith's son, but if the miller promised her father more favorable conditions, she could end up marrying a guy she hardly knew. Back in medieval times, there were certain customs around getting engaged that aimed to see if couples were a good match. In some areas, couples who were engaged could share a bed while still dressed, with a wooden board known as a bundling board between them. This practice gave families a chance to see if the couple was physically compatible without the risk of pregnancy or breaking church rules about premarital sex. During the medieval period, there was a rich tradition of sexual magic and fertility rituals that came from earlier pagan cultures. Although Christian persecution pushed these practices underground, they never completely vanished. In medieval times, peasants kept up with old fertility rituals, frequently masking them as Christian festivities or blending them into folk medicine. Even with the church trying to curb them, May Day still had a lot of sexual undertones. Young folks would often spend the night in the woods, supposedly picking flowers and branches to adorn the village. In reality, May Day provided a chance for people to explore their sexuality and engage in courtship that broke away from the usual rules of village life. It's believed that many pregnancies stemmed from these May Day encounters, which contributed to a noticeable increase in February births. Wedding festivities often featured various fertility rituals aimed at ensuring the couple's success in starting a family. People might throw grains or nuts at the bride to promote fertility. The marriage bed would receive a blessing with holy water, but it would also be secretly prepared with herbs and charms thought to boost the chances of having kids. These traditions reflected a strong desire to manage reproduction in a time when infant mortality was high and families relied on having healthy children for their survival. Back in medieval times, the idea of conception was a strange mix of Aristotelian philosophy, Christian teachings, and common folk beliefs. Doctors of that era thought that both men and women contributed seeds that came together during sex to form new life. They also believed that a woman needed to have an orgasm for conception to happen, which led to the unfortunate notion that women who got pregnant from rape must have found some pleasure in it. People in medieval times came up with complex ideas about how to affect the sex of unborn children. They thought that conceiving during specific phases of the moon would lead to having boys, while other phases would result in girls. Additionally, they believed that the position of the stars at the time of conception could impact not just the child's sex, but also their personality and future opportunities. During the medieval period, there were more advanced ways of controlling and monitoring sexuality. The church created networks of informants to keep tabs on the personal lives of people in their communities. Confession turned into a means of collecting private information about sexual habits, with priests probing penitents about their most intimate experiences. In the 13th century, the Inquisition emerged, leading to intense sexual persecution. Those accused of heresy were often tortured to reveal not just their religious views, but also their sexual behaviors. The manuals that inquisitors used during interrogations contained specific questions about sexual positions, how often they engaged in intercourse, and even the physical feelings they experienced during sex. In medieval times, prisons had specific punishments for sexual offenses. Women found guilty of adultery could be locked in tiny cages where they couldn't even stand, surviving only on bread and water until they starved to death. On the other hand, men convicted of rape might face public castration before being executed by hanging. These harsh punishments aim not only to penalize those who were guilty, but also to instill fear in the entire community, ensuring sexual compliance. During the medieval times, there was a lot of literature focused on sexual advice and guidance, but most of it was kept away from the general public. Medical writings featured thorough explanations of sexual positions and methods, yet this information was only accessible to well-educated doctors and affluent individuals. For the typical person in medieval society, knowledge about sex mostly came from hushed talks, traditional songs, and the harsh lessons learned through personal experience. The church created its own sexual literature, but its main focus was on listing sins instead of offering positive advice. Penitential manuals detailed hundreds of sexual practices, along with the punishments for each. These writings show a strong interest in sexual specifics that goes against the church's official stance on celibacy and purity. Marriage manuals from the medieval period, aimed at wealthy patrons, give us insights into the sexual lives of the nobility. These writings provided guidance on various topics, including techniques for the wedding night and how to handle sexual relationships during pregnancy. They show a refined understanding of sexual pleasure that was kept away from the general public, but was obviously enjoyed by those who had the means for privacy and discretion. During the medieval period, people began to create more complex ways to punish and control sexuality. The chastity belt, while likely not as widespread as many think, illustrates the drastic steps some individuals took to regulate female sexuality. These devices serve not only as physical barriers, but also as symbols of the fear associated with women's sexual independence. Medieval brothels existed in a complicated legal landscape, being both legal and illegal at the same time. While the church officially condemned prostitution, local authorities often provided licenses and oversight for it. In many medieval cities, there were official red light districts where prostitutes operated under government supervision. These women had to wear specific clothing, reside in designated neighborhoods, and undergo regular medical checkups. The medieval era had some really strange sexual customs in European history. The so-called rite of first night supposedly allowed feudal lords to have sex with their peasants' brides on their wedding night. Although historians argue about whether this practice really happened, just the idea of it shows how vulnerable medieval peasant women were when it came to their sexuality. People in the Middle Ages thought that sexual activities could affect everything, from the weather to how well military campaigns would go. Kings and nobles would talk to astrologers to find out the best times for having sex. believing that the cosmic forces at the moment of conception could shape their children's futures. Military leaders may instruct their troops to refrain from sexual activity before going into battle, thinking that it could sap their fighting spirit. During the medieval era, more advanced techniques for monitoring and controlling sexual behavior emerged. Local communities established complex systems of social pressure aimed at managing how people behaved sexually. Young people hardly ever got the chance to be alone together, and married couples had to follow community norms when it came to their intimate lives. Back in medieval times, the way people viewed sexual pleasure was heavily shaped by religious beliefs about the soul and the body. The church preached that sexual pleasure was a snare laid by the devil to distract people from spiritual reflection. Even in marriage, indulging too much in sexual intercourse was seen as a sin that could condemn the soul to hell. People in the Middle Ages came up with complex methods to handle sexual desire and gain control over their bodies. They practiced fasting, took cold baths, and engaged in physical self discipline to curb their sexual impulses. Young individuals were instructed to steer clear of situations that could trigger sexual arousal, which included specific foods, music, and types of entertainment. The medieval era gave rise to a rich underground culture of sexual defiance and rebellion. Even with the church trying to regulate human sexuality, people in that time discovered ways to express their desires and seek out pleasure. This hidden realm of sexual rebellion thrived alongside the dominant culture of repression and control. Medieval sexuality was influenced by practical factors that people today hardly think about. Since there was little privacy in medieval houses, sexual activity frequently took place in areas shared with children, servants, and other family members. The sounds and smells associated with sex were just a part of everyday life back then, in ways that would likely surprise us now. During the medieval period, there was a growing complexity in how sexuality and social class interacted. The sexual freedoms enjoyed by the nobility were intertwined with their overall social power. Lords and ladies had the luxury of private chambers, access to exotic foods, and ample leisure time, which enabled them to experience sexual pleasure in ways that peasants simply couldn't. In medieval times, marriage was really more about survival than love or sexual fulfillment. With short lifespans and high rates of infant death, the main goal of getting married was to have children who could continue the family line and help with farming. Enjoying sex was, at most, a minor detail and often regarded as a risky distraction from the more pressing issues at hand. The medieval era had some of the strictest sexual norms in European history, but it also brought about clever ways for people to resist and rebel against those norms. Despite the immense social pressure to adhere to religious and societal expectations, people in medieval times managed to seek out pleasure and express their desires. As we go back to Margot in her stone cottage, with Henrik's hands still reaching for her in the flickering candlelight, we can really feel her terror. It's not just a personal fear, it's the heavy weight of an entire culture's sexual anxieties resting on her young shoulders. She bears the burden of religious beliefs, family honor, community scrutiny, and her own urgent need to survive in a world that provides her with no safety. The medieval period shows us that human sexuality has always been influenced by power, fear, and social control. The strange practices and beliefs of people back then might seem odd to us today, but they came from the same basic human needs and desires that affect sexual behavior in any time period. By studying medieval sexuality, we can see how our current sexual culture mirrors the power dynamics and social worries of our own era. Medieval intimacy wasn't really intimate at all. It was always out in the open, tied up with politics, and often quite risky. The bedroom functioned like a battlefield where people fought for their souls, where family honor could either be upheld or ruined, and where the most personal moments of life were controlled by rules that seemed meant to take away joy and increase pain. The medieval era brought about some of the strictest sexual customs in European history. Yet, It also showcases the remarkable strength of human sexual desire. Even with centuries of religious oppression, social constraints, and legal repercussions, people in the Middle Ages discovered ways to seek love, enjoyment, and deep connections. Their experiences remind us that sexuality is a core part of being human, too strong to be entirely governed by any authority. The unusual and sometimes unsettling sexual practices in medieval Europe weren't just born out of ignorance or superstition. They arose from a complicated mix of religious beliefs, social systems, economic needs, and real human desires. By exploring these practices, we can better understand how much progress we've made and recognize that many of the same fundamental tensions still influence human sexuality today. Ultimately, the medieval era shows us that sexuality is always intertwined with politics, carries risks, and is a fundamental part of being human. The strange, intimate behaviors of people during that time were their ways of grappling with the ongoing struggles between desire and regulation, pleasure and risk, as well as love and the need to survive. Their challenges remind us that the search for sexual freedom and genuine intimacy isn't something new. It's an age old human desire that goes beyond any specific time in history. The candlelight still dances on Henrik's weathered face as he reaches out to young Margot. Yet, we now realize that this moment carries the full significance of medieval sexual culture. The fear, the superstition, the desperate hope to stay alive, and the never ending human desire for connection, even when the odds seem insurmountable. In her shaking hands and his rough fingers, we witness more than just two individuals. We see the clash of an entire civilization's sexual anxieties and desires unfolding in the most personal space possible. Yet, it's never really private, never completely safe, and never entirely secure.